Hey there folks, John here. I just wanted to take this opportunity to say thanks for helping me get past my first 100 subscribers. It's a big milestone that I never dreamed that I would actually hit when I started this channel. But since the viewer base is growing, I wanted to introduce a new type of content for this channel. The old pickup videos and repair videos will still be around, but I wanted to get into a little bit more in-depth content. So this is the first video in a series that I've called Bitmaps, a series of videos that go in-depth on some of my favorite points from some of my favorite franchises. Since this is the first one, I'd really appreciate any feedback you could give down in the comments. So let me know what you think, and here we go. If you're a fan of Nintendo, you probably heard about Kirby. Now, Nintendo would have you believe that Kirby is actually the hero of the series, but I've noticed some things lately that seem to indicate that we may not be getting the whole picture. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Kirby's first outing was in Kirby's Dreamland on the original Game Boy. In this story, Kirby travels through the 5 stages of Dreamland to fight King Dedede, an evil penguin king who's hoarded all of Dreamland's food. And this all sounds innocent enough, but if you look at it a little more closely, a couple of things don't seem to add up. The first of these is that even though we're told that Dedede only leads a small group of thieves, Kirby seems to be the only one fighting against the king. Like, literally every other creature in Dreamland comes out to try and stop him. I mean, if Kirby is really trying to save Dreamland, then wouldn't it be in everyone's best interest to help him take Dedede out? Take the Waddle Dees, for example. These guys make up the backbone of Dedede's forces, and Kirby faces them in just about every game. According to the Kirby Wiki, Waddle Dees are notable for not having any real form of attacking and for their peaceful nature. That doesn't really sound like a textbook evil henchman to me. Yet, Waddle Dees are by far the most common enemy you'll face in the Kirby series. But maybe there's something we're not seeing here. Are the normally peaceful creatures being forced to attack Kirby against their will? To answer that, we need to take a look at the Waddle Dees' relationship to King Dedede himself. And we gain the most insight from Revenge of the King. It's a sequel/remake of the original Kirby's Dreamland that released with the compilation game Kirby Superstar Ultra. At the end of that game, Kirby is invading Dedede's fortress yet again, while Dedede sends minion after minion to stop him. When everybody else has been defeated, Dedede momentarily considers sending his lieutenant, a Waddle Dee wearing a bandana, after Kirby. But then he decides better of it, opting to fight Kirby himself so that the Waddle Dees can have a chance to escape. Now this is where it gets interesting. Instead of immediately taking off, the Waddle Dee actually tries to convince Dedede not to fight Kirby because he's afraid for his king's life. In the end, the Waddle Dee voluntarily risks his life to stop Kirby out of a desire to serve the king that he loves, even though he has absolutely no hope of winning that battle. Now, assuming that all the Waddle Dees feel the same way, we can then conclude that the Waddle Dees are serving Dedede voluntarily. So that answers the question about the Waddle Dees. Now let's look at Dedede himself. Usually when the Penguin King shows up, he's actually not trying to antagonize Kirby at all, but rather actively working for the benefit of Dreamland. Take Kirby's Adventure, the second game in the series. In this game, Dedede has broken the Star Rod, the source of good dreams, into pieces and given those pieces to each of his lieutenants. Though this seems evil at first, we later find out that Dedede did this to prevent a creature known as the Nightmare from threatening Dreamland. And it appears that all of Dreamland was on board to help out by keeping the individual pieces of the Star Rod safe. Essentially, Dedede is taking away Dreamland's inhabitants' ability to dream, himself included, by the way, but he's only doing it to prevent a greater evil from destroying Dreamland entirely. Then along comes Kirby, who defeats Dedede and reassembles the Star Rod, only to unleash the creature from its prison, actively making the situation worse, not better, despite Dedede's attempts to prevent it from happening. But hold that thought. Let's return to the Waddle Dees for a minute. In Revenge of the King, Dedede makes the decision to risk his own life to provide his followers with a chance to escape from Kirby with their lives. Again, he acts sacrificially for the good of his people, giving no regard to his own personal safety. That doesn't really sound like a tyrant. It actually sounds a lot more like a benevolent leader who would rather sacrifice himself than force his troops to needlessly die while fighting a losing battle. With that in mind, let's go back and take another look at Kirby's Dreamland. Now we're told that Kirby is a hero who wants to save Dreamland from starvation because DDD has stolen all of the food. But if that's so, then why on earth would an entire world of otherwise peaceful creatures actively attack someone who's trying to save them? I mean, these guys throw literally everything at Kirby to try and stop him. Even the birds and the trees get in on the action. And I can only think of one answer. I think that Kirby isn't actually the hero at all. He's the invading force. And the creatures that Kirby fights aren't DDD's evil minions. They're actually Dreamland's militia. I know that seems like a stretch, but stick with me. Google defines a militia as a military force that is raised from the civil population to supplement a regular army in an emergency. DDD, even though he can be bumbling and a little selfish, isn't a tyrant. He's an unlikely military leader who, in the absence of a real army, rallied the citizens of Dreamland to face a threat like they've never seen before. These plants and animals aren't attacking anyone at all. They're just defending their homes. If you don't believe me, let's take a look at the first level of Kirby's Dreamland. In this level, almost nothing actually actively attacks Kirby. Prior to the mid-boss, the only way that Kirby can actually take damage is by running into an enemy that's otherwise minding its own business. The mid-boss, a Poppy brother, throws bombs at Kirby, but it's actually not much of a stretch to imagine this Poppy brother as a first responder, someone that gets to the scene of an emergency and actually is just trying to get it under control. Now you'll also notice that for the entire second half of the level, again, we have enemies that aren't actually attacking him. The only way for him to take damage is to run into one of these things. Even the boss, Wisby Woods, who's basically just a giant tree, doesn't actually really attack Kirby, unless you can call apples dropping from the branches an attack. Now he does try to blow Kirby away with puffs of air, but you can barely call that an attack. And even when Kirby beats him, the tree starts to cry. And you actually kind of feel bad for the guy. So assuming that all that is true, let's talk about another central character to the Kirby series, Meta Knight. This guy is leader of the Meta Knights, a group of heavily armed warriors who get in Kirby's way off and on throughout the series. Now the first time they show up is in Kirby's Adventure, which is important because it takes place directly after the events of Kirby's Dreamland. After his defeat, DDD must have realized that a militia wasn't up to the task of keeping Dreamland safe, so he decided to establish an actual peacekeeping force. The Meta Knights are that force. Throughout Kirby's adventure, Kirby repeatedly engages the Meta Knights in combat, ultimately culminating in a one-on-one showdown with their leader. Since he's the last boss Kirby fights before facing DDD himself, Meta Knight serves as DDD's last line of defense in trying to prevent Kirby from unwittingly reassembling the Star Rod and releasing the Nightmare from his prison. But Kirby defeated the Nightmare anyway, you may say. And sure, he did. Having just killed or maimed pretty much anyone who could actually help him defeat the creature, Kirby takes up the Star Rod and defeats the Nightmare on his own because he has no other choice. He practically bumbles into saving the world because he was too impatient to stop and think about the consequences of his actions. He may be strong, but he's a loose cannon who really only seems to care about saving Dreamland when he's inconvenienced. I mean, if you think about it, Kirby's method of solving problems is actually pretty brutal. He not only literally eats his enemies, he also assimilates their very essence to copy their abilities. And as his own abilities develop over the course of a few games, he can even create clones of his victims to do his bidding. I don't know about you, but that doesn't really sound heroic to me. It sounds evil. Now wait, you may say. At the ending of Kirby's Dreamland, we actually see Kirby return the food DDD stole to the other citizens of Dreamland. And you'd be right. We do see him return the food. But have you ever looked closely at the crowd in front of him? They all look exactly like Kirby. Nowhere else in the entire game, or any others as far as I know, do you see a creature that looks exactly like Kirby, except Meta Knight, but we'll save him for another time. Yet here we see a whole village of them. What if Kirby's mission in Dreamland wasn't to save the food, but to steal all of it? And what if these creatures all look like Kirby because they are all Kirby? Let's take a detour into biology for a second. Single-celled organisms reproduce by a process known as mitosis. Basically, this means that when they grow big enough, they simply split into two exact replicas of the parent cell. I highly recommend checking out the game theory video that came out on this topic last month. It does a really great job of explaining things, but it goes a little too in-depth for this theory, so I'll let you go watch that if you're interested. Anyway, what if Kirby is essentially a large single-celled organism with the ability to absorb the DNA of the creatures he consumes? I mean, we already know from Kirby Mass Attack and Kirby and the Amazing Mirror that he can split into multiple versions of himself. But we don't even have to go that far. At the end of every stage in Kirby's Dreamland, Kirby splits into 3 exact copies of himself. And we can even go further back than that, to the title screen of Kirby's Dream Land, where several exact copies of Kirby go dancing across the screen. So it's clear that he has no problem reproducing on demand. Now, if that's the case, and he's multiplying at a steady rate, then it would only be a matter of time before he grew enough to consume, assimilate, and create clones of everyone in Dreamland, adding everyone to his collective hive mind before heading off in search of a new planet to conquer. But what if DDD saw this coming all along? Could he have known that this creature of immense power, driven primarily by an insatiable need to consume everything around him, was growing within his kingdom? I think he did. Now let's go back to Revenge of the King. After the Waddle Dees escape, DDD actually says, "I'm sorry." But who's he talking to? The only person who would actually care to hear that apology has already left. And what exactly is he apologizing for anyway? I think that after the events of Kirby's Dream Land, DDD made himself a promise that he wouldn't let Dreamland and its inhabitants be conquered, used, and oppressed, that whatever the cost, DDD would save his people from this invader. This moment in Revenge of the King is the moment when he realizes that his fight is futile. That no matter how hard he tries, Kirby will continue to grow and consume until he assimilates the entire kingdom, and there's absolutely nothing that DDD can do to stop it. It really makes you feel bad for the guy. I mean, he's pretty much sacrificed everything to save his people, only to be faced with the truth that he never could have won in the first place. So he goes out swinging. When we see DDD walking with his head down at the end of the game, he's not upset that he lost to Kirby. He's upset that he's lost his home, and he knows that the inevitable has come to pass. After this point in the series, pretty much any time DDD or Meta Knight fight Kirby, they're being mind controlled by an outside force. They never really challenge him again of their own accord, either because they know that it's futile, or because they've already been assimilated into the hive. We'll really never know which one is true, but either way, Kirby is won, and Dreamland, or Popstar as it's now known, will never be the same. So even if all the pieces fit, why isn't any of this reflected in the official stories we see in the games? Well, history favors the victor, so it's not surprising that Kirby might rewrite things to show his version of events. Now, I'll pick up the new Kirby game this year just like everybody else, and I'm sure I'll enjoy playing it. But the whole time, I'll be wondering whose side I'm really on. Am I just helping Kirby expand his ever-growing empire to yet another world? In my mind, I don't see how it could be any other way. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Hey guys, thanks for watching. This was a new kind of video for me, so it was a bit of a risk, and I really appreciate you watching it. If you want to go and leave a like or a dislike if you think I'm crazy, it would be appreciated. Leave me a comment if you want to see more of these in the future, and make sure you hit that subscribe button. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.